All right. To start off, I wanted to give Nora an opportunity to talk, first of all, to introduce herself, talk about maybe more things that I didn't mention, and to talk about the work you guys have done, PEN America has done over the last year on disinformation, give people a sense of what that work looked like in practice.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Soraya. I think that the work that First Amendment Watch does is so wonderful. So I am here for whatever questions you have, and hopefully it'll be a lively discussion. I feel like anything around the First Amendment right now is very hot. So, I can sort of set the stage with just a little bit of what we've been up to, which feels like a lot, actually. When I came to PEN America, it was at a really fraught time for the United States. And what I felt was, personally, as a lawyer, a time when our discourse and our ability to engage had really just been declining. And PEN America has been wanting to, over the last many years, help defend against the threats we see to the First Amendment and to free expression, both in the U.S. and abroad. And so a lot of our work has traditionally been what many of you may have heard about. We're a literary and a free expression organization. We defend the freedom to write. And just today, one of our international cases that we've been working on for years, the Saudi activist, she was released from prison after she had been held for over 1,000 days. So we so often work on what are really intense cases, mostly abroad, where we're trying to fight for writers who have been silenced for their work. And I think the threat here in the US has felt different, but it is palpable. And it is a kind of set of systemic problems that have come together over the last many years. With the election of Donald Trump, I think we saw a kind of distancing here in the US from truth. Of course, if we think back to that time and just ignore what we now think of as the problems of misinformation, it was sort of this period where Donald Trump and allies did quite a bit to denigrate the press, to, kind of call out where mainstream media were failing. And that really that was a kind of calling card for people to build up and I think amplify their distrust of storytelling, mainstream media, the news as an industry. We then also have seen efforts online by platforms where they've seen problems with the way we interact and the way we connect with each other, that there is so much vitriol, hate, harassment. And so we've worked over the years on trying to help people who are targets of abuse online understand and make sense of how to respond. And then, of course, we've seen legislative and policy threats to free expression. We've seen journalists attacked for their work at the local, state, and federal level. We've seen protesters who, when they put their bodies on the line, are met with excessive force by police for trying to express themselves. There's just sort of this large kind of storm. And I wouldn't say it's a perfect storm, but so many issues come together. And there is a lack of funding for journalists to tell stories of what's happening at the local level. Often where there is that lack of information, people are more vulnerable to misinformation. And we're an organization that has always felt like propaganda or the use of words for manipulation is something that we have to defend against. So, from go, we've always kind of seen this issue, like the kernel of truth-telling and story, as something that we can weigh in on and help illuminate why society is at risk and what's really happening to the way we connect with each other. And I think it's ultimately, sort of like if there's a thesis to all of it, it's that, disinformation and misinformation, we could talk about the differences, they sow discord in society, they divide us. And in being unable to connect or agree on shared facts, so often we really are not able to make decisions in the best interests of who we are. Disinformation is absolutely used and wielded to disenfranchise groups, affecting their, speech. And we have seen that there are ways that we can help fight back against that. So I'm happy to talk eventually about some of the solutions we see.
Absolutely, thank you.
That was a lot.
But America does a lot. I think that's one of the challenges to summarize PEN America's work requires multiple paragraphs. But we're a First Amendment group. You are a First Amendment lawyer by training. And something you and I have talked about is that can be challenging to succinctly describe is why misinformation is a First Amendment issue, even when the government can't technically punish people for publishing false information, even harmful information like fake cures for COVID or doctor videos of protest. So the first question, I think, is a really great starting point. Why is the spread of misinformation a free speech issue, even if it does not involve government regulation of speech?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's a timely question. I think that what we're seeing with the impeachment trial is someone, former president, making the argument that misinformation is somehow protected speech. So I'm happy to get into that as well. But we can start from how we came to the issue and how we see it as a free expression in First Amendment, kind of where the nugget of the problem is. I think if we step back, you know, the digital age created this ability to access information, connect with each other in really exciting ways. When we think about how the internet, which I don't get to do very often, but, you know, imagining back when blogs were a thing and it was really exciting to comment on a blog, you know, the idea that we could somehow open up access in ways that we had never before, where you and me as everyday people can connect, we could find each other potentially and discuss and debate issues. And of course, that made room for anyone to promote anything. What has come forward, I think, is this both pay for play, you know, paying and the service of disinformation, as well as the political interest in manufacturing narratives that sway people. And so misinformation is the spread of false or misleading information that frankly doesn't even have ill intent. Disinformation, just as a distinction, is that same kind of content, but which is created or disseminated with the intent to mislead. So when we see something online, whether it's something maybe you shared that you don't have any ill intent, but you just don't know it's false, or something that a bad actor, whether it is a foreign actor that's interfering in our elections, it could be a domestic actor interfering in some of our issues and the ways we feel about the immunization process. When we see that, we will make a whole host of assumptions. We will see a piece of content and not really think about if it's true or false. We'll often accept it. You know, we're really emotional when it comes to information. And when we do, that then brings with it a whole host of behaviors, attitudes. We will base how we proceed on what we see. When we are manipulated and when the use of words are used to create narratives and realities, it makes our ability to really connect with each other all the more hard and difficult. We are then up against this kind of insurmountable task of proving the objectivity of what we're talking about. And I don't know if you've had the experience of talking with someone who believes in misleading content or stories. People often cherry pick the facts now. You know, they'll say, well, here's the article I found that proves what I think. And then they'll say, well, here's a journal, a medical journal of findings, you know, scientific findings that show what I believe. And we've gotten to the point where there's sort of this like lack of truth. I think of it almost as like the post-truth era of people are able to find facts to suit their bias. And part of what's happened, I think, is it's become harder and harder for us to actually come together, to debate, to have shared knowledge we agree on. We may not agree on solutions. You and me may not, other people here may not, but at least when we are in sort of this unfettered ability to express ourselves, we can debate on the merits of issues. We no longer can do that because we're always defending the merits of a certain position based on a set of facts. And so slowly misinformation has contributed to people not voting, contributed to people taking actions that can harm themselves, whether it's bodily, moral, socially, politically. All of those affect the ways that we engage with democracy. And so it's a difficult thread to needle is the truth. You know, when someone asks, why is this a free expression issue? But we firmly believe as an organization, as a First Amendment lawyer, I believe that when we are not able to ascertain what truth looks like, we can't make decisions in our own best interests. And that affects the way we engage with people and the way we present ourselves.
That makes, yeah, I think, you know, at its origin, the First Amendment, where like a lot of the concerns were about government restricting the flow of information, often from a free press. And the understanding or the intention was to limit the constraints of the press and limit the powers of a government's abilities to constrain a press so that more information can flow. But now you have an abundance of information, and you have an abundance of unchecked information that has made it in some ways difficult for first people to decipher between true and false, but also made it easier for people to selectively decide what universes they exist in, and consequently more difficult for people to engage with the other universe. And that has implications for democracy that could affect people's willingness to vote, for people's willingness to listen to government backed information about public health. And that is a free expression concern because people are more willing to mistrust news, or people can't, well, I think that's where I stumble is, I think people misinterpret free expression sometimes as purely openness to the widest possibility of voices. And that's in some ways true, but there's also a degree of quality of information, a concern for people's ability to access quality information. Is that in some ways what you're getting at?
I mean, yes, is the short answer. And I think a piece of this we haven't gotten into yet, but which relates to the title and how you and I talked about this event, was the role of the news, and how, there has been this kind of hardening of, and I don't want to say clickbait because it isn't clickbait, but our news cycle has produced things that people will click on, that will kind of inflame and draw them in. And that's the nature, I think, of the 24-hour news cycle. At the same time, there has been an absolute effort to denigrate and discredit the press. Some of that was led by our former president. I think there have been long systemic failures of the media to appropriately lift up stories of groups such as Black, Brown, other, indigenous, people of color in this country. People are rightly distrustful of the media in many instances. I think just the way they are distrustful of the medical industry. And we could talk about things like Tuskegee, but generally this isn't new, but it is proliferating faster than we can keep up with. And I know someone in the chat also said, is this new? It's always been around. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. In the 1940s, PEN America wrote that we defend against mendacious publication. We believe in the quality and sanctity of a kind of, credible journalism that can help undergird informed citizens of a democracy. That is harder and harder to come by. Local journalism is suffering a crisis where not enough funding has created, gaping holes in journalism coverage around the country. We've seen then the models where Facebook, Google, other platforms showcase news, and local platforms are not being paid or adequately, taken in through the financial incentives of the platform. So there's just this kind of confluence of issues now that have created, I think, this fever pitch where disinformation is all the more potent, it proliferates faster, and more of us are vulnerable when we don't quite know how to ascertain what we're seeing online.
So there's a lot there. I'm going to unpack. I want to start, maybe get into some work that you did. So say the government does want to address this issue, say, during the early part of the pandemic, when there was very little scientific information out there, just yet. Most science moves slowly. We need to recognize that. But at the time, people were uncertain. And what happened was people started, including our president at the time, coming up with ideas for how to cure COVID, or false notions for where the virus came from. And something you started to see was actual state governments, local governments trying to implement fake news laws to punish people who spread fake news. And I know that you worked on a specific case in Puerto Rico where you filed an amicus brief. I think PEN America did in Puerto Rico. Can you talk a little bit about that amicus brief and why the instinct to pass fake news laws is maybe a bit misguided?
I mean, this is a topic I find fascinating. And as a lawyer, when I started thinking about misinformation as a phenomenon, I intuitively thought, we should limit access to and somehow crack down on purveyors of misleading content. I didn't have a word for it. I wasn't thinking fake news statutes or, criminal laws, but I was just sort of like thinking through a few years ago, avenues, I'm like, what are the solutions? And so I was brainstorming and I thought intuitively that feels really right. And I actually think it's good to tell that story because we all have to work through problems, maybe not publicly working through the brainstorming, but in thinking through that, I worked with some colleagues and we all started sort of looking at how those types of ideas play out. What are the unintended consequences of things like fake news statutes? And often we've seen abroad in places like Singapore, Brazil is pushing a fake news law. There are a number of them. Morocco is one. These are often used to crack down on journalists and dissidents, not actual purveyors of disinformation, where I would feel, eager to find ways to hold those actors accountable. So in Puerto Rico, back in March of last year, the governor passed a kind of constitutional amendment that would create penalties for anyone disseminating false information about public health emergencies, which, if you think back, March, April 2020, that was at the height of sort of the confusion, the mania, the concern of what was going on during the pandemic. And journalists were really at the front lines. They were trying to report on what we needed. I mean, do you remember the toilet paper phase? Like, did we all need to go out and buy toilet paper? Like, reporters were actually looking into what do we need to stay alive? So it was a moment where maybe laughable now in retrospect, but it was like very scary, I think, for communities. And part of what we found problematic with this case in Puerto Rico is that the governor's solution to quell hysteria was to crack down on anyone sharing false information. Similar to the statutes we've seen abroad, we were really worried that this would actually just be a vehicle to target journalists. And sure enough, there were a few journalists that came forward saying they're really worried about and now self-censoring how they think about their reporting on COVID and what they can share or cannot share. So we supported this case in filing an amicus brief for the ACLU. And since there have been some developments, notably the governor walked back some of the constitutional amendment language. There are still concerns, and so we proceeded with the case still. The court accepted our amicus, which there was sort of back and forth about whether they even would accept it. From a rule of law perspective, we were worried about that and hoping that we could make sure our voice and sort of the concerns for journalists was expressed. But in the ways that it might implicate how we think about solutions, I just think it's important for us to be creative and nimble in how we brainstorm, but also to maintain a view and consideration of the unintended consequences. Because these types of statutes absolutely in other countries have been used to target people who are actually trying to just connect others to critical information.
I think something that you just brought up is it's twofold. So one is that it can chill journalists, and one is that it can actually just be used by government as a pretext to silence or punish journalists who say are reporting on something that's critical of the government, maybe reporting on an inaccuracy in government data. So maybe the government, the specific, I think, text of Puerto Rico's law was that the way that they described what was false was things that contradicted government information. And that was at a time in which the government was still trying to find out about what the virus, how the virus functioned, and how people should detect it. Again, at a time when journalists were doing the same thing and might, in some scenarios, find information before the government. So they could be publishing factual scientific data that contradicted the government's data and then be theoretically punished for it. So you just get into the brainchild of like why these laws have unintended consequences. Now, I'm seeing, I think, some questions in the Q&A that I think maybe pave into this other questions, thinking of unintended consequences. Something that you and I have talked about, or I think makes sense to get into then is, guttural responses, things that make immediate sense, and then maybe things that happen afterwards that we don't want. And I think that's a vague way of basically saying we had a president who used a private platform to spew a lot of false information that led or at least encouraged, I'm using extremely euphemistic language to be diplomatic, but let's say encouraged Capitol riot, an attack on the Capitol. And private companies decided to remove him permanently, as Twitter did, Facebook did, from their platform. Afterwards, people called this, including him, his supporters called this censorship. Why is that an inaccurate description of what happened? I know that that's PEN America's stance. And then also, I want to talk about, well, let's start with that. Why is that an inaccurate description of what happened?
Well, I love the notion that people will express their opinions, of course. When Trump was permanently suspended from Twitter, people took to all forms of, social media saying that this was, a First Amendment violation of his free speech rights. They were up in arms. And, I think the important distinction is not to be too foundational about it, like a First Amendment lesson here, but let's do the First Amendment lesson. I mean, I think it's important for us to know what the First Amendment says, which I won't read, but it essentially creates an avenue for protection of certain things, 5 things in particular that Congress cannot make a law to abridge, which has since been found that government essentially cannot restrict or regulate in certain ways, various things, which is, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and then the ability to petition the government for redress. Those are my 5 favorite things. I love them. I go back to them all the time. Free speech is one of them, of course. And so much of our work as a free expression organization in the US really gets back to these elements of the First Amendment. But Twitter is not the government. So Twitter removing a public figure, or anyone for that matter, for violating its community guidelines or rules is not actually a First Amendment issue. Literally, government and Twitter are not the same thing. And I think it's important just at base to help make that clear to people. That doesn't mean there aren't other issues implicated. And I think it's really good for us to be talking about the issues that are implicated. As an organization that wants people to connect, we believe in unfettered access of some sort to what others think. I actually think it's incredibly important to have a kind of unedited or unvarnished and look into what someone like Donald Trump was saying. He was a public figure. When he was running for president, incendiary as his language was, I think it's important for the public not to somehow not have access to that. It is critical, not just for his rights, but frankly for our rights to know what he was saying. The balance, though, that has to happen on private platforms is when those words have real world consequences. And what we're struggling with now as an industry, and I think the digital free speech world, is how do we proceed when we know that there are real world consequences and harms for what happens online? I mean, it could mean someone is psychologically affected by being harassed and doxxed, or otherwise targeted, like an individual journalist. But this also then could be the kinds of cases we see with Donald Trump, where he has been one of the biggest super spreaders of misleading content for years. When he and a small set of other people were removed from Twitter, a very fast study found that 73% of misinformation that had been shared was no longer on the platform. That type of data is really critical for us in making the case that there are unique and important circumstances when removal is the correct course of action. I don't think it always should be. And part of what we all need to work through is, how do we balance these tensions? How do we try to give people access to what others are saying? How do we allow leaders to express themselves in unedited ways? But how do we also make sure then that there are not consequences out in the world where they are damaging both bodily and for democracy?
Yeah, I think going over again, I think one of the things that stuck in people's minds about the First Amendment is they see it as not just government, but powerful bodies making decisions for a large public without the public having a power to appeal or take part in that discussion. And I think that what you actually saw was for many, many years, these companies, not to put a crown on them or anything, but that they were still kind of given to their consumers. They wanted to give people access to Donald Trump's speech as newsworthy content. And then in a moment, the balance shifted and they decided that ultimately, based on kind of information you just gave, that measurement no longer worked. I think that it doesn't mean you can't still be nervous about the power of these companies. I think that you can hold both those truths in your head at once. You can say that this one act isn't quite, that removing Donald Trump is not abridging the First Amendment, is not violating the First Amendment, and that these companies have enormous power, and then that's a problem we have to wrestle with. I want to move. I noticed that some of people, the title of this panel was Journalistic Solutions to Misinformation. So I want to get into the nitty gritty of how journalists can respond to misinformation. One thing that I've been thinking about is, let me look at questions. Let's go into right now a top question with vaccines. What advice do you have to reporters who are working with communities that have good reason to not trust medical authorities, specifically people of color, African American communities, or Latino communities who have a history of being of medical system abuse and worry that vaccines will harm them?
I think that's a great question. I have so many comments generally, on like how we can help and how we work with journalists on solutions here. Where medical issues and COVID come in, I think one thing is to not wait to cover certain stories about what people are asking. There is legitimate concern, fear, and uncertainty around what the vaccine looks like, what the side effects might be. It is incumbent on journalists to cover stories that grapple with that hesitancy, to not run away from it, while also not creating kinds of stories that don't take into account context. The number one thing I always say in any context, frankly, whether it's the election or unrest, when we were looking at the insurrection, protests, any category, is report denominators. I realize that journalists are not editors and often don't have say in their headlines, because that's another issue. But so often reporting can overlook the scale at which something is happening. So when there is a side effect, let's say of the COVID vaccine, so often it takes many paragraphs past the lead to get into the context and the scale of what we're looking at. Readers very rarely, when I work with people in training them on how to spot misinformation, they'll pretty much openly talk about how little they read of an article. And I think that means that it is, unfortunately, the journalist's role to give people things early, meaning early in the process of issues and early in their actual reporting of a piece, to talk about front and center, what are the questions audiences have, and making sure that they're engaging with their readers in advance to give them the things that people want. So there are sort of a number of steps when you're thinking about something concrete like distrust in the vaccine. One is be careful and just like kind of question, is this the story worth telling? Is this one side effect where someone felt the chills going to help everyone? If it is, how can you frame that in the larger story of what herd immunity looks like, what the numbers look like in your town of how many people are being vaccinated, and that one side effect, for one person happened out of 10 or out of 100 or out of 100,000. That can help readers either move from the concern and uncertainty and miseducation to then actually feeling like at the very least they are armed with facts. And that's where we want readers to feel like they're not being somehow patronized, but they're engaged early and often, armed with tools and information they need.
think the last word you just used, I think patronized comes particularly when we talk about misinformation, you know, way back when we used to say things like, oh, how are people so stupid to believe this? How kind of like, you know, why aren't they reading enough? And why don't they know this already? And having that tone or having some kind of dismissive tone is in some ways will have the opposite effect of informing people, or will discourage people from not that journalists all do this, but that even a reader who's talking to somebody who maybe recently came to believe something that is unfounded, the tone matters. And I know that that's something you guys talk a lot about in your media literacy training, is, you know, patience and not talking down to people, but kind of with people.
Yeah. I mean, I'll get into media literacy in a bit, but I think it's, whether you want to call it something like engagement journalism or listening to your readers, you know, there's so many ways we can frame what it is, but it's really just actually listening and providing communities with what they need. And you know, I think that because I'm not a journalist, part of what I'm always careful about is not being prescriptive about what media needs to do. But we work with journalists, we work with editors, we also work with readers and online users. And part of what I have found most successful is bringing media, like journalists and editors, together with communities to kind of like, frankly, talk about and give an under the hood look as to what journalists really do, to help communities slowly break down the distrust they have, and for journalists to be able to showcase what they really do. You know, like we could, you know, maybe it's sort of like the sausage making, but literally like, how do they do it? And even the most basic thing that I know, which is that so often journalists don't have a say in their headline, you know, communities think that. And so they'll latch onto it and say, why was this headline written this way? And I'm like, well, let's bring editors and journalists together with communities and talk about it. And if you don't have, you know, part of what I think we can talk about is money. Like if there isn't money to do this in some holistic way with like feedback and listening sessions for outlets, just starting with a conscientious and empathic way of engaging with communities is an excellent place. And from there, we can always get more engaged.
I think that's true. Someone in the chat is talking about how journalism is no longer a viable profession. And I think what maybe she's getting at is the lack of money that supports solid journalism, the money that gets put into maybe what people would call clickbaity stuff, although I don't want to denigrate industries, but I think we can go there. I do think that there's still some meaty stuff. I know that you don't want to be prescriptive of what journalists do, but I also know that you worked closely with groups, both on-ground activist groups, trying to dispel misinformation in three different crises contexts. So pandemic, you also worked a lot during the summer protests, and you worked a lot with groups during the election. Just to look at I think during the protest, one pattern I saw was how often videos and images were taken out of context, sometimes literally years out of context. Sometimes you would take these that had nothing to do with the event at hand and manipulated to tell a certain story. How did the journalists you work with deal with that? Did they, or was it kind of like, we just have to say that this video isn't accurate?
I mean, so back in the summer when we started seeing, you know, George Floyd was murdered at the end of May, and then protests started popping up around Minneapolis and then around the country. And we have now seen the largest, longest sustained social movement in this country's history. And that is something that actually, from a First Amendment perspective, I always want to recognize. With that, we were unsurprised to see misinformation being used as one of the ways to try to divide organizers, to create a kind of chaos online so that people didn't quite know what to do. You know, one example was some colleagues of mine contacted me from Atlanta. I used to live and work there as a litigator, and they shared with me that there were fake Gmail accounts sending emails to people to come out to protests that weren't happening, like completely illegitimate places. Though those places exist, people would get to those places and there was no protest. So there were sort of levels of, I think misinformation and certainly disinformation in trying to lure people out. So fake accounts was one thing we saw. I also then was alerted, because of my journalist colleagues, to the ways that videos were being reappropriated from other contexts. So, and we saw it during COVID even. We saw videos of German shoppers fighting over food, and people thought that was happening in the US, when in fact it was from 2013 and in a different country. With the protests, people were sharing things like, this is happening down the street. Look at this, huge mob. And a lot of those images and videos and memes were taken wildly out of context, miscaptioned. And if you didn't have the kind of media literacy skills to slow down and question what you're seeing, you'd make a bunch of assumptions. You'd wonder how violent this was, who were the bad actors infiltrating and throwing bricks in places. And so part of what we did was we tried to really quickly assemble a set of recommendations on how both journalists and everyday people online can think about disinformation in the protest context. So I can share in the chat, we put together this guide about these very issues. And, it just, as more reports came in, I think one of the questions we received was, what is the role larger of the media and of how it clings to objectivity? There were questions around how long has the media, how do we hold up a kind of objectivity to help balance and fight against bias? But what does that objectivity serve us when there isn't a larger accountability push where the media can tell stories in a way that clearly, have some bias, but are illuminating difficult truths that we have to examine? And that was a question that over the many months during the summer, we ultimately came to, is just, we have to wrestle with that, and we have to work with journalists to wrestle with it.
I think one thing that you saw was a lot of people, a lot of journalists pushing for things like government documents to back up claims. So things like not police reports, that's what people end up writing down, but for example, how many people got arrested during a protest and for what reason? And having that kind of, these are, in this context, these are protests where often protesting police violence and protesting excessive police force against specific community members, where the tension is between this government agency and protesters, and there's disputes about when, whether the journalists who are covering this are biased or have some greater sympathies for protesters. When you can get access to that kind of government information and include it or incorporate it into your story, I think that's those kinds of ways to bring maybe meat end up combating anecdotal stories, however strong and however engaging they are. That doesn't mean anecdotal stories or human-based stories aren't useful and great, but I think those were ways I saw journalists trying to push against a lot of the numerical disputes, like how many Black Lives Matter protesters were arrested for curfew violations, who hadn't actually met curfew or hadn't actually been around past curfew. We have 20 minutes. I don't know, I want to open the floor for more Q&A for more people who are currently watching to kind of pose questions. I see a few people have already asked. Let me look at some of them. Okay, so Lee Kreibel is saying, per the Twitter, Facebook discussion, with private companies essentially now controlling access to major sources of information for large sectors of citizens, should the state action doctrine be altered or applied to allow for regulation of these platforms, since they are in effect fulfilling government purposes? And Lee points out that Edwin Chemerinsky, the dean of Berkeley Law, actually wrote an op-ed kind of pushing for that approach. What are your thoughts, Nora?
Well, the state action doctrine is really this principle that the Constitution and the rights then that are protected under that apply only to the government. So, of course, then private conduct doesn't have to necessarily comply. There are numerous conversations right now at the legislative level about various solutions, if you will. Solutions meaning, how might we regulate what is happening online to hold people accountable and to provide an avenue for relief? You know, last week, several senators dropped what is the Safe Tech Act, which is an effort to amend Section 230. Section 230 is having its anniversary this month. I think it's the 25th anniversary. And then there are other measures. I mean, so many discussions, debates around how to find or create the contours in this new way of living. You know, part of what I'm worried about is overcorrection sometimes, or over removal, over regulation. I don't think that's a reason not to have debate, but I see, just taking platforms, for example, they often will, in the moment of a crisis, in mass, remove accounts and posts as a sort of accountability measure to be able to say, look at what we did. I call this moderation theater, where it's like seen as something actionable. And there are often unintended consequences, to get back to what we talked about at the beginning, where people with legitimate speech, organizers, will get kicked off of these platforms. I think in the same way, if we create measures that are, if we amend something too aggressively, I worry that there will be other unintended consequences. So I think the Safe Tech Act, for example, is actually a really measured, an interesting approach to make sure that there are civil rights carve-outs and other carve-outs where Section 230 does not apply. That is not the state action doctrine, but it in some ways similarly would have an effect that Edwin and I haven't talked, but what I think might be similar. So in that way, you know, I don't think we're anywhere near getting some kind of regulatory solution here. And part of what, in a much larger sense, I think we need moving forward is an interdisciplinary set of paths forward. We need platforms to take this seriously, to mitigate harm proactively before they implement measures. They need to have people who are civil rights, free expression advocates in-house thinking about these issues. We need those platforms to inform users of misinformation and other forms of manipulation. We then need regulators and policymakers to take this on very carefully and think about what are the avenues where, you know, the kind of liability we would need to pursue is carefully crafted to avoid rampant misuse. And then I think we need people like you and me to be aware of what we're seeing online. It's part of why we created a media literacy project at PEN America, why we are so committed to helping to empower people online, because so much of what we've seen on platforms and even from regulators is sort of like putting quite a bit on everyday people. And, you know, if platforms are asking for users to proactively flag content, that assumes people will recognize the content worth flagging. And I don't think we're all there. And if we want to get there, we have to up our digital literacy. So I'll share some links, and I want to make sure other people can have room for questions. But I think the state action doctrine question is fascinating. And I haven't seen what Edwin said, but I would love to dive into it.
Yeah. So why don't you can share I also can send, after this event, I have everyone's email addresses and I can make sure that Nora gives me some of these links and I can send them to people. The question from Nick Auburn, do you have examples of local news networks that have succeeded right now? What are they doing and how are they supporting staying afloat?
Oh, that's a great question. So PEN is a membership organization, and we have members around the country, some of whom came to us several years ago, talking about and voicing the problems and challenges they were facing because the local news industry was collapsing and it is in crisis. And so over the last few years, we've started examining that problem more, looking at what's been happening with news deserts, if you want to call it that, analyzing what are potential legislative solutions to bolster local news. In the middle of COVID, we spent a lot of time working with dozens and dozens of other organizations like Free Press, Common Cause, truly dozens, on fighting for emergency stimulus funding for local outlets that were suffering. Feels like an intractable problem. And I'm happy that there have been really interesting innovations. Text-based outlets are a fascinating one. We've also seen hybrid models, nonprofit outlets, a number of ways that outlets have been really creative in thinking about what their structure looks like and then how they give communities information. Some of the groups we've worked with, whether it is the Seattle Times, they received emergency stimulus funding, which was really useful to keep them afloat. We've worked with groups like City Bureau, worked with groups like Documented, which is a small nonprofit news outlet in New York, which provides information and news often on WhatsApp for immigrant communities. There are some amazing innovations and groups that are doing great work. It's still against these insurmountable odds sometimes. And so part of what I hope we can do is help ease what those odds are, to help advocate for more funding for local outlets, and to also then make the path forward shorter, to be able to kind of get to yes sooner, where outlets know, if they can apply for one of our Press Freedom Incentive Fund grants, that would be amazing. If there are avenues for other grants, I think that that's really kind of where the future is moving. And we've seen legislative innovation, but for the sake of time, I'll kind of put that aside because it's a little adjacent. But again, I'll put some links in the chat.
One thing that I've thought about, and I know that in your report you have a caveat, but generally government funding for news organizations, the first thing that you think about is, yes, but on what terms? And you certainly want to make sure that those editorial decisions made by these groups that receive government funding isn't guided by whatever policy or whatever government is in place. And we saw that with Voice of America and Trump's appointee, whose name is now escaping me despite having written about it. But you want to have, in whatever legislation gets put out to help local news, some caveats, some clear provision that ensures that they retain editorial independence.
Yeah, Michael Pack and USAGM. I mean, we joined an amicus brief in that case as well, because I think that editorial independence is critical. In some of our advocacy, we have tried to figure out, are there safeguards where we could push for public funding, like an expansion of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? Are there ways where there could be some kind of commission and sort of federal commission of experts who examines and propose solutions for local journalism that can somehow stem the bleeding? And I just think they're hard questions. Australia is trying to take some of this on. There are other countries, Spain, various places in the UK. So it's really, kind of fascinating actually. And it's so like uncharted territory now that we're all trying to bring the best experts together to brainstorm, like, how do we move this forward? How do we think about solutions that maintain independence, you know, like a free press.
We have another question by Marek Tkatsik. I'm definitely mispronouncing the last name and I apologize for that. It says, hi there, should big tech, Twitter, Facebook, etc., be responsible for what is posted on the platforms by the users? Thank you. So I think this gets into section 230. Why don't you take the floor?
I mean, this gets back to the comment I made when I said that I think we need a kind of like interdisciplinary set of solutions where there is, I think about like section 230 plus, a kind of expanded form, well, a limit on the immunity of platforms, but in ways that are very carefully crafted. And we haven't seen that yet, is the truth. So should platforms be liable? Platforms have opened up space for people to engage, and the things that people now have access to are absolutely causing issues in the real world. Not to mention, and this is sort of one of the lines a lot of people talk about, but you know, free speech is not the same thing as free reach. And often it is the most incendiary, controversial, hateful content that gets seen and amplified the most. So if you're asking, you know, like, how should they be liable? Should they be liable? My first question is, what does the data say? Because there is very little transparency out there about what the platforms are doing and what impressions different pieces of content make on real users. You know, they kind of operate in this black box where, for example, Sheryl Sandberg said that there were other platforms used more than Facebook for the insurrection. But we don't know what impressions some content made on X number of users. I think we need that data to be able to then make the case in a very clear, persuasive way that the harms somehow point to Facebook being liable. But I don't want, especially as a lawyer, to make that argument until I have the best set of facts in front of me.
I also think I just want to talk a little bit about why Section 230 was even conceived. In the earlier stages of the internet, even now, when people create an internet platform, smaller places, it's smaller websites, for that kind of business to be held liable for, say, the comments on their of third-party statements on their platforms, liable being like they could be sued, for example, for defamation, or being sued for often defamation for comments made by third parties. None of these companies could end up existing. They would be totally swarmed with lawsuits. And so what Congress did at the time was, in order to give them a degree of space to innovate and grow, so that they had to create this caveat, or they believed that this caveat was necessary, so that companies wouldn't be overwhelmed by the amount of litigation that would have stifled innovation and internet, the expansion of the internet. Now, responsible, you use the word responsible, Merrick. I think it's a broad term. What does responsibility look like? And I think I really like Nora's point of just like, so let's start with some transparency. Let's start with some responsibility to your consumers to know what goes on behind closed doors, and to have some kind of data, clear data, access to data, so that researchers can look at it and report back to the consumers. I see that we have like 4 minutes left. I think maybe the great ending to this would be to give you some space to talk about media literacy. I see that there are some people in the chat who are talking about it. What is media literacy? The cynical question is it even possible? Aren't we all doomed by our psyches? We're going to be predispositioned to outrage and to partisan beliefs. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is my favorite topic because from my time as a movement lawyer, I believe in people and the power of people. And I believe that media literacy is one of the ways that we build up our power and feel empowered with taking control of our digital experience. So I see it as one of the promising ways we can combat mis and disinformation. Media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, understand, and engage with what we see. That's really what it is. And some groups like partners of ours, News Literacy Project, really look at news literacy. We, as a project, I shared the link, our Knowing the News project really tries to take a bigger picture look at what is media literacy, the ability to feel confident, to access, understand, engage with a whole array of things, whether it's news, memes, other types of content. So the internet isn't going away anytime soon. I think our digital intelligence is something, and our media literacy as a society is something that has to improve. And part of what we do is we work with communities, often in bilingual trainings with closed captioning. We're committed to accessibility, trying to reach as many people as we can across different political areas and divides to train people to feel equipped to identify what they see. So whether it is literally understanding the basics of what different sort of the categories of dis and misinformation are, why we are susceptible as human beings to these things, and then how we can use the various types of proactive measures to really take charge of what we're doing. I think it's so exciting to imagine how a healthier internet can begin with the way we curate our feed, the way we think about how we're engaging with content and information, and to seek out and be stimulated by what we see, not to somehow have an emotional response and feel scared or controversial or angry, but really to engage with each other. And, I think part of that is really because I am a constitutional lawyer. I see the value of engaging with each other, of like, we can find ways to disagree, but still discuss. And that is what we need to get back to in sort of the United States, and I think globally. So our work over the last year, we trained about 45,000 people around the country using media literacy techniques and tools. Part of that is, of course, to really just expectation set for people around the election, to kind of pre-bunk for them what they could anticipate. We're working now on sort of how do we bridge divides, how do we bring people together, and how do we help people like you and me talk with others who are sharing misinformation. And so a big piece of my work sometimes feels like I'm a therapist, like just talking with people about what they're seeing. And I always say that, if we can call people in instead of call them out, that is a great place for us to start. Can I recommend a media literacy source? Well, I would start with our trainings. And then from there, I think there are some amazing groups also doing work that we partner with. So, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm Attorney Nora. You can also check us out at pen.org because everything is there. And our next set of workshops are going to be around Black and Latino mistrust of the immunization process and how to look at misinformation about COVID. And then we're also going to be doing some trainings on the First Amendment and kind of bridging the issues you and I talked about today with like hyper technical legal topics. So I hope that gave you a good overview.
I think it did. I'm really pleased. And I'm going to share very quickly a slide. I'm going to share some of our resources. First Amendment Watch, in addition to being a news site, is also an education resource site. And we have a number of teacher guides that are meant for journalism professors and journalism students, but also for history, political science, communication studies professors and students who are interested in learning about the First Amendment and contemporary questions related to it. So things like Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook disinformation lawsuits or defamation lawsuits. We have a teacher guide on protest, where we actually cite PEN America's report on anti-protest laws. And we have a whole range of things, so please check out our site. We would love to have any of your feedback, whether our things are work, and also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you so much. And please email us if you have any other questions. I'm going to sadly end. Someone's asked if this is going to be recorded and they can share it. Yes, I will post it on our site. So that gives you an incentive to check it out. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.